You're listening to continuing coverage in the Las Vegas Reporter murder trial of Robert Tellez from the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today. Now, back to the courtroom.
Thank you, everyone. Please be seated. All right. Judicial District Court, Department 12 is now session. Officer Michelle Levitt presiding.
Okay, good
Come to
morning.
order to be seated, please.
Does the state stipulate to the presence of the panel?
Yes, Your Honor.
And the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Gemmner had to step out, but with your permission, I can just start. if that's
Sure.
okay.
Go ahead, you call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The state calls Anastasia Barton.
Anastasia?
If you'll please watch your step. Remain standing, raise your right hand, please, clerk.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
You may be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name for the record.
Anastasia Barton, Anastasia
May I proceed? How are you employed?
I am a forensic scientist trainee at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department Forensic Laboratory in the biology and DNA detail.
And how long have you worked there?
I have worked for Metro for approximately 8 years. I've held various positions during that time frame. I started as a forensic laboratory assistant, and then I promoted to forensic lab aide in October of 2016 until I promoted to forensic laboratory technologist in the biology and DNA detail in July of 2018. And I held that position for approximately 4.5 years until I promoted to forensic scientist training. And that is my current title. I've had that title for approximately 2 years.
Okay, so it sounds like in 2022 you were a forensic technologist for the DNA lab
Yes, that is correct.
for Metro.
Yes.
What does that person do, a forensic technologist?
A forensic laboratory technologist is the person who will receive items of evidence, examine them for the possible presence of bodily fluids or DNA, test those items for DNA and put them through a lab processing. And once a DNA profile is generated, that is when a forensic scientist comes in to interpret the data that came from the samples that I have lab processed.
So you're coming in contact as a forensic technologist with the actual evidence, like swabs or actual physical pieces of evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
And you receive that evidence in sealed evidence bags?
Yes, that's correct.
Is part of your responsibilities checking to make sure that the bag is properly sealed and no one has tampered with it before you open it and start dealing with the evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
When you are dealing with the evidence, are you wearing like regular clothes, or do you wear some sort of protective clothing in order to avoid contamination?
I wear personal protective equipment, and that is my lab coat, my face mask, as well as my gloves. We also use sterile procedures in the form of cleaning our bench space and laying down sterile filter paper and always working evidence before known samples.
And when you say always working evidence before known samples, can you explain for the members of the jury what that means and why that's important?
Yes, evidence samples are items of evidence that are collected from a crime scene. They are also known as question samples sometimes, and that is because we don't know the source of whose DNA could possibly be on them. They are from a crime scene. Whereas a reference standard or a known, or usually it's called like a buccal swab, those are known samples because we know where they came from. If a buccal swab is submitted, that is a standard. It is coming from inside the person's cheek. So they take a cotton tip swab and they'll swab the inside of that person's mouth. And it is considered a known standard, a reference standard, because I know whose cheek it was collected from.
And so obviously it's important to keep reference samples separate and apart from questioned evidence to avoid any possibility of contamination?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, when you get an item of evidence that, say, is like a swab or a cutting or something like that, what does it look like when you're doing your work, or you were doing your work as a forensic technologist?
The item of evidence, it really depends on what it is. First, there are different packages that an item may be placed and contained inside. Bigger items might be in a cardboard box or a paper bag. Smaller items can be in manila envelopes. So you start by examining the outside of the package first and documenting the seals and the integrity of the package to make sure it's intact. And then, depending on what the item is, when you open the package, you will verify that whatever is listed on the outside of the package, there will be like an inventory of the items that is inside that package. You will verify that anything that is in that package is correct with what you were expecting and what was requested for analysis. So usually like swabs, smaller items, there will be smaller envelopes inside of a larger outside envelope.
Okay. And then do you do something with the items of evidence, like put them in a test tube, or how do you extract the potential DNA source?
Yes, any sample that I take, depending on if it's a cutting I have taken or I've consumed an entire swab for my testing that has been submitted, they will all go into a test tube, and there will be a reagent blank that is controlling for that sample, for that extraction set, and those will all be in tubes from that point. So the item of evidence is separate from the extraction.
Okay. And there's sort of a control within that to make sure that the testing went through correctly and that there wasn't any kind of variability in the testing?
That's correct. I believe I mentioned reagent blank when I mentioned extraction. Those are samples that have absolutely no DNA in them. They are just part of the sample set. So I'll have maybe 10 samples that I'm working. There are 10, swabs, for example, that I've cut. So there's 10, and then there's 2 reagent blanks that are initiated. So all of the reagents, all the chemicals that I am adding for that extraction process will be added to all of them. So that ensures that the chemicals that we are introducing into all of the samples, we have control for them. We know that there's not expected to be DNA present in those because it's just a regular blank tube with those chemicals.
Okay, and so you can tell if everything's functioning properly, because if your reagent blank showed the presence of DNA, you would know like something went wrong in the testing process?
That is correct. The reagent blanks are a method to check our quality control to make sure that a blank is blank, that there is no DNA detected in that sample. We also have negative and positive controls later on in the process to ensure, again, that the chemicals that we're using, that they're working properly, and as well as our instruments are working properly.
Okay, so I want to talk about this case now. What items of evidence did you work on or conduct, I guess, the forensic testing process on in terms of this case?
For this case, I was requested to examine fingernail clippings from the right hand and the left hand of the decedent, as well as a swab from the right hand and the left hand, a swab from a left ankle and a left foot. And there was also a reference standard, that is that known sample that was submitted, and that was from the decedent, Jeffrey Gehrman.
Okay, so all of your samples were fingernail clippings, hand swabs, a swab from the left ankle, and a buccal swab from Mr. Gehrman himself.
There was also a left foot.
Left foot,
yes.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
All of those, fair to say, were collected at the autopsy of Mr. Gehrman?
Yes.
Okay. And all of those items, I assume, are separated by location, like the left fingernail clippings aren't thrown in with the right fingernail clippings, that sort of thing?
Correct. Everything that is impounded is expected to be in its own separate package. And if I were to notice some kind of discrepancy, it would have been documented. A CSA or a detective would have been notified. But in this case, the items that were listed on the outer package matched the description of the envelopes that I received, and everything was packaged separately. So the right fingernails were in a separate envelope from the left hand fingernails, from the right hand, from the left hand, and then there was a separate package that had the left foot swab and the left ankle swab, and the swab from the decedent, Jeffrey Garman, was also in a separate package.
Okay. And you keep all of those samples from the various locations separate when you're doing testing as well?
Yes, that is correct. We and I only examine one item of evidence at a time, and that is to ensure that we're keeping the integrity of our work process. So once I am starting and finishing up an item of evidence, I will change my gloves. I will clean that bench space. I will lay down a new filter paper, and I do this every single time for every single case.
Okay. So when you are working with an item of evidence, and in this case, the items that you just listed, do you do any kind of preliminary test for the presumption of blood?
Yes.
And can you explain to the members of the jury what that is?
When there is a stain that is indicative that the stain could possibly be blood, usually there'll be a stain on an item that would have a reddish brown color to it. I will perform what is known as a PT test. It is a chemical test for blood, and what that is a color test. So I will test a small portion of like a stain, if there's a stain present, and if the color changes pink, then it is positive, and it is a presumptive test. So it was positive for the presumptive blood test, and if there's no color change, then it is just negative. It's a negative presumptive blood test.
So I want to leave aside the reference sample, the buccal swab of Mr. Garman, but in terms of the swabs of the hands, the fingernails, and the left ankle and left foot, what were what did that presumptive test reveal about those items of evidence in terms of whether they were presumptive for blood?
All those tests turned pink, so there was indication that it's positive. So it was documented to be positive presumptive blood test for all those samples.
Okay. And you said that you also had the buccal swab of Mr. Garman. I assume that wasn't positive for blood. That came from his mouth?
That was not tested for blood. That would not provide any contextual information if the decedent was bleeding or not. And that is just cut and processed into the extraction process.
Okay. And you, at the time you were doing your testing, did you have a reference sample from someone identified as Robert Tellis?
I did not.
Okay. So you only had the samples collected from autopsy?
I also received, there were handbags that were packaged, but those were not requested for analysis, so they were documented as being in the package and received but not examined. And I also received a package that had shoes, but they were not requested for analysis.
Okay. After I assume you did testing on all those items for DNA, the presence of DNA.
Yes, all the items that were requested.
All the items that were requested, which included the swabs of the hands, the fingernails, and the left ankle and left foot?
Yes.
Okay. After you complete your testing, there's data generated on each of those items. Is that fair?
That is fair to say. We do have several steps throughout the lab processing. The first step can be the screening process. The second would be extraction, where we apply chemicals and heat in order to break those cells open. And then there's a quantitation step to determine the amount of DNA that may be present in those samples. And that gives us an indication of the quality of the sample, whether or not there's inhibition present or degradation present. There's different values that can be interpreted. And then there are additional steps like amplification, where we make many copies of that sample in order to have enough DNA to produce a profile. And lastly, we put it on an instrument to generate a DNA profile. So in this case, I sampled the items, I extracted them, I put them on the instrument for quantitation, but I did not interpret the data or continue the lab processing portion going forward. Another person in the lab, a forensic scientist, stepped in and continued that process.
Okay, yeah, you got my next question. So that very last step of the interpretation, that was done by a different individual at the Metro Lab?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Could I just have the court's indulgence for 1 second? I think that is it. Thank you. I will pass the witness.
Thank you. Cross-examination?
Yes, thank you. Ms. Barton, at the time that you performed these tests, you were acting as a forensic laboratory technologist trainee, correct?
No, that is not correct. I was a forensic laboratory technologist. My current position is forensic scientist trainee.
Okay, so you're currently then a forensic trainee as we speak.
Yes, I am finishing up the 2-year process, at which point I will promote to forensic scientist 1.
You had testified that presumptive blood tests were performed upon the samples provided to you.
Yes, I did.
Those were of the hands of the decedent?
Those were on all of the evidence samples that I have tested, the fingernail clippings and all of the swabs from the hands, the left and the right, the left ankle and the left foot. Those were all tested for the possible presence of blood.
Now, as to the test, the presumptive blood tests on the hands, were they from both the left and right hands, or were there separate presumptive tests as to each hand?
Each hand. They were individually packaged, so one was worked separately from the other. So when I take my bench paper and I open my envelope and I describe what it looks like and I document the staining present, at that point I will make certain determinations for if there's staining present. Do I want to test this for the possible presence of blood? Yes, I do. It's characteristic of possibly containing blood, and I will test that sample. I will cut it and put it in the tube, at which point everything goes away. The envelope, the swab, envelope that contained that swab will go into that package. I will bleach down my area. I will lay down a new filter paper. Then that next sample comes out once that area has been cleaned and a bench paper has been applied. Then I will start the process over again, documenting what that staining is, what that swab looks like, or fingernail clippings, whatever was submitted. I start over kind of fresh. So those were tested for the possible presence of blood separately.
As to the hands, was there a presumptive positive for both the left hand and the right hand?
Yes, that is correct.
As far as the fingernails, was there a presumptive test done on each fingernail, or were the fingernails grouped together?
The fingernails from each hand were grouped together. So there were fingernails from the right hand and the left hand. So each individual fingernail was not collected separately. It was collected by hand. But the left and the right were in separate envelopes. Yes.
Same question concerning the left ankle. Presumptive positive, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
But not the right ankle, or that was not submitted to you for presumptive testing?
That's correct. I didn't receive a request for analysis for a right ankle.
Same question concerning the left foot, presumptive positive?
Yes.
For blood?
Yes, that's correct.
Nothing was submitted to you for the right foot?
That's correct. It was not requested for analysis.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Just one question. Ms. Barton, you said you're a trainee for Forensic Scientist 1.
I'm a forensic scientist trainee. It is the entry-level position of that classification. Forensic laboratory technologist has different job duties and responsibilities, as I've described, receiving the evidence and doing the lab processing. When you become a forensic scientist, you're then trained on analyzing data and statistics, calculations, and report writing. So I kind of shift gears a little bit. However, I can perform the entire process all the way through. I am fully trained.
Okay. And the person who, in this case, who ended up analyzing the data that you got from these items of evidence, that's sort of the job that you're going to have next, right? The interpretation.
Yes, that's correct. It's the job I currently do. I do perform interpretation. However, my classification is trainee. I have finished the training program. I am signed off for independent casework. I have taken qualifying exams and proficiency tests even in order to test my competency in that skill set that I have developed since promoting.
Thank you. No other questions, Your Honor. Thank you.
We have no follow-up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you so much.
Today. You may step down and you're excused from your subpoena. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
And the state may call our next witness.
The next witness, Your Honor, is Melanie Klobuchar.
remain standing, raise your right hand, face the clerk.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
You may be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name for the record.
Melanie Kolenovic, MELANIKOLJENOVIC.
May I proceed? How are you employed?
I'm a forensic laboratory forensic scientist employed with the biology DNA detail at the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department.
How long have you worked in the DNA lab?
I've been full-time since January of 2020.
Okay. You were working in the lab then in 2022?
Yes.
Okay. And your position, what does that mean you did day to day?
When I started in 2020, I was a forensic laboratory technologist, which consisted of receiving items of evidence, screening or examining them, and then performing lab processing on them. Currently, I'm a forensic laboratory scientist trainee, which consists of the same thing, except I'm also in training to be a forensic scientist.
And the last part of the training would be the person who analyzes the data?
That's correct.
When you were a technologist, you were handling items of evidence and doing extractions and that sort of thing on it?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. We just heard from your colleague describe that process, so I'm probably not going to repeat that with you. In 2022, though, you were the technologist, so you were dealing with items of evidence?
Yes.
Okay. And just so we're clear, when you were dealing with items of evidence, did you wear any kind of protective clothing in order to avoid contamination or that sort of thing?
Yes, I wear a lab coat. My hair is kept up in a bun away from my shoulders and my face. I also wear a mask and I wear gloves, which I change regularly throughout the examination and lab processing process.
Okay. Now, in this case, you were dealing with several items of evidence. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Can you give us I don't know if you have it memorized or with counsel's permission, if she could refer to a report. Can you kind of list out the items of evidence that you dealt with in this particular case?
I did perform 2 examinations of different unit records. Would you like both of them or just one at a time?
One at a time, I think.
Okay. May I refer to my report? Thank you. So for the first one, I received in one package a swab from the interior side of the left gray shoe, a swab from the bottom of a left gray shoe, swab from the interior side partial right gray shoe, swab from a piece of black, white, and gray rubber, swab from a handle of scissors, which was referred to as AB5, swab from handle of scissors, which was referred to as AB6. Another package contained a swab from an interior blade of a Husky folding knife. And then in another package was 5 tan straw hat pieces.
Okay, so let's start with the shoes. I'm going to put on the overhead what's been admitted as states 263 and then states 272. Do those items look familiar to you?
They do not, because when I say a swab from, that actually means I just received like a cotton swab from the actual item. I did not receive the item or actually look at the item or determine where to swab. The swabs were given to me by the person who analyzed the shoe and swabbed that.
So we have testimony from a crime scene analyst who worked in the field. So sometimes they would swab a piece of evidence and then you just see the Q-tip or the swab that's been impounded?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's labeled for you so you know what the swab relates to. Is that fair?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So with regard to what was labeled to you as a left gray shoe, interior side, and then the bottom of the left gray shoe, did you do any presumptive tests for blood on what was identified to you as left gray shoe swabs?
Yes, I did.
And what were your findings?
May I please refer to my, thank you. So for the interior left side?
The interior side of the, left gray shoe.
And that's lab item 13?
That is lab item 13.
Okay. That was negative presumptive blood.
Okay. And what about from the bottom of that left gray shoe?
That was also negative presumptive for blood.
Okay. You also received a swab from the interior side of a partial right gray shoe?
Yes.
And also pieces I'm going to put on the overhead now, states 274. What was identified to you as pieces of black, white, and gray rubber?
Yes.
With regard to, let's go back to the partial right gray shoe, what was that in terms of whether it was presumptive for blood or not?
The swab from the partial right shoe was the positive presumptive for blood.
And then putting again states 274, with regard to the pieces of black, white, and gray rubber, what was the presumptive, what did the presumptive test tell you?
Positive presumptive for blood.
Okay. In addition, you swabbed some scissors, is that, or you received swabs from scissors?
I received swabs from
Yes.
scissors.
I got to get that straight. How were the scissors described to you, or well, they were identified, I guess, the swabs as AB5 and AB6, is that
Yes.
fair?
Yes, specifically from the handle of the scissors.
Okay. I'm going to put on the overhead what's been admitted as states 259. And I think we can see there's a evidence marker there that says AB5. And then this is states 261, which also has a marker of AB6. With regard to those two swabs that you received, can you tell me whether or not they were positive, presumptive for blood?
Both swabs for AB5 and AB6 were positive presumptive for blood.
And then you were asked to do a presumptive test on an interior blade of a Husky folding knife. I'm putting on the overhead states 256. What was your finding whether or not the knife was positive?
The knife was negative presumptive, or the knife swab that I received was negative presumptive for blood.
Okay. And so the scissors were positive, but just to be clear, the knife itself was negative.
The swab I received, yes, was negative.
Okay. You also received items or from a hat. This is states 285.
Those I did physically receive, so I physically received the hat pieces.
Okay, so you would have done the swabbing on those?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And I assume, well, actually I should ask you, how do you do the swabbing on that type of item?
So this item was impounded differently than how this photo shows. So the items that I received all of them in a large box where each individual hat piece, as you see on the screen, was in its own individual brown paper bag. Per our policy, we do not have lab items opened at the same time. So with the approval from DNA management, because we didn't know where the interior lining of the hat would be, I had approval to swab the lining of each piece with one swab. So the way that looked, to keep with our procedures of not having multiple items opened at once, was I had clean butcher paper down, I was in my PPE, and I would open up one item, I would examine it to determine if there's any possible staining or to see if it had that interior lining that we were looking for. And then I would swab that with a clean swab, and that would go into a clean label tube. That hat piece would then be put away, the area would be cleaned, and another hat piece would be opened up to determine if there was a lining there. There was only 2 hat pieces that had lining, so the only 2 of them were swabbed with the same swab, and that went into one tube.
Okay. And with regard to the hat, did you do that presumptive test for blood?
On certain stains that I noted, but not on the swab itself.
Okay. And with the stains that you did do, what were the findings?
Those stains were negative presumptive for blood.
Okay. Now, you did additional work on other items of evidence, is that fair?
That's correct.
Okay. And many of those items, or several of them, were swabs taken from a vehicle?
That's correct.
Okay. And so that's the same thing where obviously you don't have the car in front of you. You got swabs or like Q-tips of what was done by a crime scene analyst?
That's correct.
Okay. And did you also get or examine clothing that was collected?
Yes.
And I'm going to put on the overhead states 166. And did that clothing include Sperry shoes, like a right shoe and a left shoe?
Yes.
And did it also include a shirt and shorts?
Yes.
Okay. And then you also received swabs taken from the crime scene, or identified to you as taken from a crime scene?
That's correct, yes.
I'm putting on the overhead states 149. Now the swabs that you worked samples on with regard to those items, were they labeled to you as AB3, AB4, and AB5?
Yes, they were.
Okay, and they were identified as being taken from AB3 as a bush, AB4 as a bush, and AB5 as a butterfly?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, I want to kind of go back on these a little bit. The swabs that were all taken from the car, were any of those presumptive for blood?
They were all negative presumptive for blood.
Okay. Now, with regard to the Sperry shoes, what were the findings with regard to whether they were positive or negative for blood?
I identified several stains on the shoes, and of the stains I tested, they were positive presumptive for blood.
Okay. What about the T-shirt?
The T-shirt, also of the stains that I identified, were positive presumptive for blood.
And what about the shorts?
As well as the shorts, the stains that I identified were positive presumptive for blood.
Okay. I want to go back to States 149. These swabs that were taken from AB3, 4, and 5, which are the bush, and the butterfly, what were your findings with regard to whether they were positive presumptive for blood?
The two swabs from the bush, AB3 and AB4, were positive presumptive for blood, and the swab from the butterfly, AB5, was negative presumptive for blood.
Okay. And so on that one item, AB5, that, to be clear, that butterfly, which is like a lawn decoration, that one is negative, but the ones from the bushes were positive?
That's correct.
Okay. So after you completed that presumptive testing, I assume, not obviously all at the same time, but all of the items that we've been discussing, you put in test tubes and went through the normal DNA processing?
That's correct.
And then once that processing was done, does another analyst from Metro look at the data in the job that you're currently a trainee for, and does that person analyze the data?
Yes, she does.
Was there any discrepancy or anything unusual in the testing process that occurred when you were analyzing these items?
No, not to my knowledge.
If anything, if you were to see something happen with like a reagent or something like that, does Metro policy and probably lab policy require you to take note of it?
Yes, and depending on it, we will also document it. And if anything is not caught, it will also be in our review documents. That's available in the case file.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll pass the witness.
Yes, thank you. And we'll start with the end of your testimony. We'll refer to the beginning. In reference to the items of clothing recovered from Mr. Gehrman, you had testified that the shoes were tested, presumptive test for blood, and both shoes, the topsiders were both positive for blood.
Yes. Do you mean, sorry, Mr. Gehrman's shoes?
Yes,
The ones
Mr.
I physically,
Gehrman's shoes.
yes, yes.
And the shirt that was worn by Mr. Gehrman, presumptive test, blood.
Yes.
Same thing with the shorts, presumptive blood test, positive for blood.
Yes.
In reference to the bushes, it was specifically AB4, AB3, again, presumptive positive blood.
Yes.
And that would have been the area based upon the diagram surrounding Mr. Gehrman's body.
To my knowledge, yes.
Let's turn your attention now to the vehicle. You were called upon to conduct presumptive tests for blood.
Yes.
And it was a subject vehicle. Do you know the type, the make, or just that it was from a vehicle?
It usually just says V1 or Vehicle 1 when describing the vehicle.
And just so we're clear, the swabs that you received and tested presumptively for blood were negative.
That's correct, yes.
The straw hat, the multiple pieces, you tested presumptively negative for blood.
The stains that I located were presumptive negative for blood, yes.
Were those swabs also taken in order to test later for DNA?
No. For the sampling process, due to only looking for possible trace DNA, the staining was just in case if I saw anything, and due to them being negative presumptive, I did not take them forward. However, the stains are still available if you would like them to be tested.
So just so we're clear, then the hat was not tested for DNA?
The hat lining was tested, but it was not tested for, well, it was tested. The stains that I noted were tested for possible blood.
Okay, but nothing more?
Besides the possible trace DNA, nothing more.
Okay. And again, we're talking about the lining versus the exterior. The lining was obviously tested for DNA.
Yes, the exterior was not.
Okay. Was it, and nothing was found as far as DNA concerning the interior of the band of the hat? Or there was, but it was very weak?
The findings of the DNA would be better explained by the forensic scientist who interpreted the results.
Fair enough. As to the knife, presumptive negative, correct?
That's correct.
Now, the scissors handle was presumptive positive.
Yes, for both of the swabs.
But as far as the blades, the cutting part,
I did not receive the cutting part of the scissors, so I am unable to say.
in reference to the shoes, the left gray shoe, presumptive negative.
You mean the shoe pieces?
The shoe pieces.
Yes. I'm sorry, can you please say which lab item it is?
Yes. In order for just easy to work, you tested two shoes, correct? The gray shoes.
Yes.
One shoe was whole, the other was cut to pieces.
Yes, one pair of shoes I physically received, the other pair of shoes or shoe pieces I only received swabs from.
Okay. If you could narrow down your testimony concerning the shoe pieces.
Okay, yes.
Presumptive positive?
Some were not. So 2 of the pieces of the shoe were negative presumptive for blood, and 2 of the pieces of the shoe were positive presumptive for blood.
Can you tell the court what other substances other than blood may create or cause a presumptive positive?
There could be rust. Rust is also known. There are false positives in cases of, I wouldn't say false positives because it's still blood, but animal blood can also be positive but will produce no DNA results due to us having a human-specific DNA testing kit, but they can still show presumptive positive blood.
And in reference to these findings, we can't necessarily date whether that rust or animal blood or perhaps human blood had been there, correct?
That's correct.
Now, as to the other shoe, the whole shoe, presumptive negative.
The Mr. Gehrman's shoe?
No, we're talking about, we already addressed Mr. Gehrman's shoes, the Perry topsiders.
I've only received, the naming that I have doesn't say which shoe is whole. I apologize. It says swab from interior side of left gray shoe. Is that the one that
Correct.
Okay. Both of those for the interior left side of the gray shoe and the swab from the bottom of the left gray shoe were both negative presumptive for blood.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Can you be direct?
Just briefly, I just wanted to ask a couple clarifying questions about the hat.
The hat and hat pieces, there's 2 parts of it, as I understand your testing. The first is you swab the lining of the hat to maybe get a wearer profile, if you could.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and then there was staining on the outside that you thought possibly could be blood, but when you tested it, it was negative presumptive for blood?
That's correct, yes.
And so the outside that was negative presumptive for blood, that wasn't moved forward for additional DNA testing, is that fair?
That's correct. And the stains are still available on the hat for additional testing if necessary.
Okay, but the wearer profile that maybe you'd get from the lining, that was further tested for DNA?
Yes, the swabbing taken from the inner lining was taken forward for lab processing.
Thank you. I have nothing else, Your Honor.
Any cross?
No, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony here today. You may step down and you are excused from your subpoena. Thank you for being here. And the state may call the next witness.
Kimberly Dannenberger.
And please watch your step. Remain standing, raise your right hand, face the clerk, please.
You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
You may be seated. Please state and spell your first and last name for the record.
Kimberly Dannenberger, Kimberly, DANNENBERGER.
May I proceed, Your Honor? Ms. Dannenberger, how are you employed?
I'm employed with the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Forensic Laboratory in the Biology DNA section.
How long have you worked there?
I have worked at the Forensic Laboratory for approximately 15 and a half years, and I've been within the Biology DNA section for approximately 13 and a half years.
And what is your job title?
I'm a forensic scientist.
Okay, and you've done that for 15 years, is that about right?
I've been doing casework for the past 12, so part of that 13 and a half years within the Biology DNA section included training.
Okay. What is your educational background that allows you to work as a forensic scientist?
I have a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in cell and molecular biology. I also completed an approximate 16-month training program within the biology DNA detail, and that training program encompassed everything that I would need to do my job. So analyzing items of evidence, putting them through a series of lab processing steps, generating DNA profiles, making interpretations on those DNA profiles, making comparisons to any known individuals who have been submitted for that case, as well as report writing and generating statistics.
Okay. And have you testified before as an expert in the area of forensic science, specifically with regard to DNA?
I have testified before, yes.
How many times do you think you've testified?
Prior to today, I've testified 87 times.
Okay. Can you give us just kind of an overview of how DNA is used in a forensic setting?
So, just a little background, DNA does stand for deoxyribonucleic acid. It is what makes us who we are. It's the building blocks for each of us. So between two humans, approximately 99.9% of our DNA is the same, coding for everything that our body needs to do to function. It's that approximate 0.1% that makes us unique. So the type of analysis that I am doing is within that 0.1%. So coding for eye color, hair color, skin color, what makes each of us unique. So DNA analysis is looking at that kind of portion. We target very specific locations, but ultimately swabbings or samples are taken from items of evidence, submitted to a series of lab processing steps to generate a DNA profile.
Okay. And a person's DNA profile, is it the same regardless of where a sample is from versus like a buccal swab versus blood? Would those reveal on the same person the same DNA profile?
Yeah, so depending on, DNA does persist throughout your body. So if I have a sample of blood and a sample of saliva, if it does come from the same person, will be the same DNA profile.
Okay, and what is meant by the term reference sample?
So a reference sample is what we use in the laboratory to describe an item of evidence known as typically a buccal swab kit, but it's an item of evidence collected for the purposes of DNA from a known individual. So based on who the outside packaging says was collected from, we can say that this profile came from this individual.
Okay. Now, with regard to this particular case, did you prepare a series of reports with regard to various items of evidence that were collected in the Garriman murder case?
I did, yes.
Okay. Now, did they span over several months?
Yes, in total, yes.
Okay. Now, on some of the reports, we've heard testimony from two forensic technologists that they handled particular items of evidence and ran it through DNA processing. I assume on those items of evidence, you analyzed the data?
Yes, so for each of the reports that were authored, I was the analyst that did all the interpretation, regardless of who did the front-end processing and or sample collection.
Did you ever work with any of the original evidence or like evidence where you were the person doing sort of the sampling and that sort of thing?
For the original report, I did not have hands on the actual items of evidence. I did do part of the lab processing.
Okay, and with regard to the lab processing, what did you do? What items did you work on?
So we're talking about the original report, correct?
Well, actually, yeah, I'll back up. We'll just go in order. Okay. Let's start with your original report.
Okay.
And it was issued on, do you know what date?
May I refer to the report?
Thank you, Your Honor.
So the original report for this event number was issued on September 5th, 2022.
Okay, and so when you issued this report on September the 5th of 2022, there were various items of evidence that a forensic technologist took samples from that you later looked at the data and analyzed. Is that fair?
Yes, I did the analysis for these items.
Okay, and those items include a reference sample from Jeffrey Gehrman, right hand fingernail clippings, left hand fingernail clippings, a swab from the right hand, a swab from the left hand, swab from left ankle, and a swab from left foot, correct?
Yes.
At that time, on September the 5th, did you have a reference sample from Robert Tellis?
I did not.
Okay. So in this report, the only evidence that Metro was in possession of on September the 5th was these, well, there were probably other swabs impounded, but there was no reference sample for Robert Tellis yet obtained. Is that fair?
That is correct.
Okay. So let's talk about this first report and what your findings were. I want to talk about the left hand, the right hand, the left ankle, and the left foot. With regard to those items or those swabs, what were your findings with regard to DNA?
So referencing those items, referring to my report, those 4 items, the results were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor, foreign DNA was not detected.
Okay. And with the left hand fingernail clippings, what was the finding with regard to that?
So for the swabbing from the left hand fingernail clippings, the conclusions were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor, the DNA profile is consistent with a mixture, including at least 1 male. Due to the limited nature of the foreign component, it is unsuitable for interpretation, and no further conclusions can be made.
Okay, let's talk a little bit more about that, just so we're clear. So this, the left hand fingernail clippings, the DNA evidence was analyzed, and I think you said there was evidence of a mixture. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
How does that look different when you have a mixture as opposed to a single source of DNA?
So when I'm doing DNA analysis, the profiles that I'm looking at, they're equivalent to like peaks on a graph. So visually, you can just visualize peaks on a graph. So when a sample is single source, depending on the number of peaks that I see and the data itself, I can make the conclusion this is from a single person. The more peaks that are added, I can then conclude that this is from a mixture DNA profile. So the mixture part is dependent upon the profile itself.
Okay, and in this case, there was an indication of a mixture, but I think you said it can't be interpreted further?
Yeah, so for this sample, a mixture was indicated. I was able to assume Jeffrey Gehrman on this sample. It's what we consider an intimate sample, so fingernail clippings from a person's body, there's a reasonable assumption that their DNA profile can be there. In this case, his profile was there. So the peaks that are left over, there wasn't enough for me to make any further conclusion. It's limited, so I can't do anything further.
Okay, and that's just sometimes how DNA turns out? You get data that can't be interpreted further just because of the nature of the sample?
Correct.
And are there factors that affect that, or it just depends on how it's collected, or what is collected, or environmental factors, anything like that?
There are lots of factors that can affect DNA analysis in general. I'm never going to know what kind of profile I'm going to get until I actually run the samples through our processing steps to generate a DNA profile. But in terms of what can factor in, amount of contact between 2 items, was it left out in the elements? These are just generalized factors, not specific to this case.
Sure.
Has there been any chemicals applied since, the contact may have occurred? I think I said handling with something touching for a long period of time or just a short amount of time. Any environmental factors such as being left out in the sun or rain, etc. So in terms of generally for DNA, there are a lot of factors that can affect how much DNA is potentially still on an item of evidence by the time it is swapped for analysis, either by crime scene or by someone at the laboratory.
And you can't tell from lab results what may have affected whether or not there was more sample left or more interpretable sample left.
Correct. DNA can answer the questions of who potentially was a contributor to this profile, if someone included or excluded, and I can answer the question as to where that profile came from, so the fingernail swabs. but I cannot answer timeline questions. I can't say how the DNA came to be on an item of evidence, when it came to be on an item of evidence, and why.
Okay, so let's go back to the September 5th report of 2022. You also analyzed the right-hand fingernail clippings swab, correct?
Yes.
And what was your conclusion with regard to that on September the 5th?
So on September 5th, the interpretation was this was a mixture of two males. I did assume Jeffrey Gehrman. Again, these were fingernail clippings collected from his person, so there was a reasonable assumption that he was there given the data. And so the conclusions at that time on September 5th were assuming Jeffrey Gehrman is a contributor to the mixture DNA profile obtained, foreign DNA was detected.
Okay, and did you have enough DNA in that case to have a possible profile for that foreign DNA?
Yes.
Did you know whose it was?
No, at this time I only had one reference standard that had been submitted to the laboratory, and that was Jeffrey Gehrman.
So you have kind of this unknown profile associated, or well, in the same sample data as Jeffrey Gehrman's profile, would that be fair?
Yes.
Okay, and so when you have an identifiable profile but you don't know whose it is, are there databases that you can enter a profile in?
There are, yes. If the sample itself meets eligibility, then there are databases that we can use.
And was that profile entered into databases?
It was, yes.
And which one, or I mean, just generally, can you tell us which ones it was entered into?
This profile was searched, you're talking about the level, I'm sorry.
Of the identifiable foreign DNA profile, was that entered into any databases to see if it matched anything?
It was, yes.
And those would be national and local databases?
So for this case, it was able to be searched at a local level, a state level, as well as a national level.
And in all those databases, did you get any results about who could possibly be the source of that profile?
At that time, I did not, no.
Okay. So let's move on to September the 7th. You ended up preparing 2 reports on September the 7th of 2022. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. So let's, I think, start with what items of evidence you actually received on September the 7th. On that date, did you receive a reference sample?
So, sorry, yes, so this is referencing supplemental number 2, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So first of that, September 7th, 2022, this is referencing my report as supplemental 2. I did receive a reference standard from Robert Tellis.
Okay, and that came to you in the form of an evidence envelope?
Yes, it came in the form of what's called a buccal swab kit. That is going to be a swabbing of the inside of one's cheek.
And September the 7th is the first day, I assume, that you had a sample from Mr. Tellis?
Yes.
So did you analyze that particular item, or did you actually process it, do the forensic processing of that buccal swab?
So for this supplemental, I did work this case from beginning to end.
And were you able to generate a profile from Mr. Tellis's buccal swab?
I was, yes.
And did you ultimately compare that to that unknown profile that came from the right fingernail clipping swab?
Yes, so this reference standard was compared to my original conclusions to that original data. So that comparison was done.
And what were your conclusions then?
So for the comparison of the buccal swab from Robert Tellis to the swabbing from the right-hand fingernail clippings, there was support. So Robert Tellis was included as a contributor to that profile. And the probability of observing the mixture DNA profile is approximately 40.9 septillion times more likely if it originated from Jeffrey Gehrman and Robert Tellis than if it originated from Jeffrey Gehrman and an unknown random contributor.
And can you kind of explain why DNA is reported out as a probability, or give us some context for that number?
So this number is what we call a likelihood ratio statistic, and it's the probability of the evidence. So it all relates back to the evidence. So the probability of the evidence, which is that swabbing from the right-hand fingernail clippings, compared to 2 different competing scenarios. So scenario 1 is that this DNA profile came from Jeffrey Gehrman and Robert Tellis. And scenario 2 is that this profile came from Jeffrey Gehrman and someone unknown, random. I don't have another buccal swab kit for them. So the probability of that evidence, given these 2 competing hypotheses, is the statistic. So there's more weight for the hypotheses or the scenario that it's Robert Tellis and Jeffrey Gehrman versus Jeffrey Gehrman and an unknown random contributor.
And that ratio, or that is numerically 40.9 septillion more times?
So that was the statistic, that the probability of the mixture profile is 40.9 septillion more times more likely if it's that scenario that I just talked about.
Okay. And that was reported out in one supplemental report from September the 7th. Is that correct?
Yes, that was all done on September the 7th. And again, that was using the original data that was reported out on September 5th.
Okay. And that evidence was originally, that evidence was worked by your colleague, Anastasia Barton?
Yes, so the report for September 5th, she was the one that had basically eyes on the evidence. She was the one that sampled from the evidence. She did start the lab processing steps that we go through. I did take over part way in the lab processing steps, so I did finish the lab processing and wrote the report. But she was the one that had the evidence. I never actually saw the physical evidence.
Okay, so you never handled the fingernail clippings, right hand, anything like that. You just have the data from that.
Yes, so I never handled the actual evidence.
Okay. Now, I want to move on to your second report from September the 7th, and it appears these were rocks with staining collected from the crime scene. There were 2 rocks and a swab from a bird bath.
Yes.
I'm going to put on the overhead states 149. And those were identified to you as AB1, is AB2 and AB6, is that correct?
Yes, based on the impound information.
Okay,
yes.
Right. Like crime scene analyst collects it from the field, and then you have their label. Is
Yes,
that right?
yes,
You're not
but-
going out to the field.
No, this is all based on the crime scene analyst, the description of their packaging.
Okay, and AB1 is described to you as a circular rock with staining, and AB2 is a rectangular rock with staining, and swab from AB6 is from a bird bath?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, let's talk about those 3 swabs. What were your conclusions with regard to them?
So all 3 of those items, so the rocks, I actually did the sampling myself, so I was the one that swabbed those 2 items, and then the swab was given to me, so crime scene swabbed on scene. All 3 of those items were consistent with 1 male contributor, and Jeffrey Gehrman was included as a contributor on each of those items.
Was there any indication of a mixture on those items?
The conclusions for these were 1 male.
Okay. So you prepared another report, and this one I think was from, September 12th of 2022. Is that right?
That is correct, and this is supplemental 3.
Okay, so let me just make sure I have these items. And these items consist of what was identified to you as a left gray shoe, interior side, the bottom of a left gray shoe, partial right gray shoe, pieces of black rubber, and swabs from handles of scissors, and a swab from a knife. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about those. I apologize, I'm putting on the overhead states 274 and 263. So let's talk about the what was identified to you as the interior side of the left gray shoe. Were you able to get interpretable data from that?
Sorry, let me just referencing my report. So for the swab from the interior side of the left gray shoe, that was consistent with originating from 1 male contributor.
And were you able to include Mr. Tellis as the source?
Yes, he was included as a contributor to that profile.
And are you able to give us any kind of numerical context that similar to what you described for the right hand fingernail clippings?
Yes, so the probability of observing this DNA profile is approximately 1.34 octillion times more likely if it originated from Robert Tellis than if it originated from an unknown random contributor.
Okay. You also were dealing with, I guess this would be your lab item 15, a swab from the interior side of the partial right gray shoe.
Yes.
And I'll put on the overhead states 272. What was your finding with regard to that, the interior of that?
So the swab from the interior side of the partial right gray shoe was consistent with one male contributor, and Robert Tellis was included as a contributor to that profile.
And was Mr. Garriman excluded from being a contributor on that shoe?
Yes.
You also analyzed or had data on black, white, and gray rubber. Is that right?
Yes, referencing lab item 16.
And what were your findings with regard to that?
So that was consistent with one male contributor, and Robert Tellis was included as a contributor to that mixture.
And
that profile.
And how about Mr. Garriman?
He was excluded.
Okay. And I want to put on the overhead states 261 and 259, which are reported to you as swabs from some scissors. And they're labeled to you as AB5 and 6. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
What were your findings with regard to the scissors?
So both of those were consistent with originating from one male contributor, and Robert Tellis was included as a contributor to those profiles.
Okay. Was Mr. Garriman excluded?
Yes.
Let's talk about swabs from a hat that was identified to you as from a hat. This is states 285. Did you look at DNA data generated from a swab from this, identified to you as swabs from this hat?
Yes.
And what were your findings there?
So this would be lab item 20.1, swabbing from the inner hat pieces. The DNA profile obtained is consistent with a mixture of at least 5 contributors, with at least 2 of those being male. Due to the complexity of the data, no additional conclusions can be made regarding this mixture profile.
And when you say complexity of the data, in non-scientific terms, does that mean there's just too much information there to make it interpretable? Or how, in your words, how would you put it as a scientist?
So based on the data that was obtained, there was an indication that there were at least 5 people present on this item of evidence. So once we hit the point where there's at least 5, that profile becomes too complex for us. I cannot make any comparisons to any known reference standards, so I did not compare either Jeffrey Garriman's DNA or Robert Tellis' DNA to this item of evidence. Once it was 5 people, at that point the interpretation stops. It is too complex.
Okay, and that's because there's just no indicator, there's a danger of interpreting data like that. It might not be reliable scientifically because there's just so much information, or?
Yeah, we can kind of relate it to there's just too much information, and also it relates back to based on validation data, and there's just too much.
Okay, so I'd like to move on to, I think your last report was from January 2nd of 2024?
Yes.
And you were given swabs from a vehicle, and then some swabs from clothing, and then also swabs that are reported to you as from some bushes at the crime scene?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so all of the vehicle swabs, were you able to analyze the data as to those?
Yes, so every item of evidence that was sampled for this report did go on to DNA analysis, so DNA profiles were generated.
And what were the findings with regard to the swabs from the vehicle?
Did you want me to go through each?
Sure.
One? Okay. So referencing lab item 27, which is a swab from the interior driver door handle pull area. Assuming Robert Tellis is a contributor, the DNA profile obtained is consistent with a mixture, including at least 1 male contributor. Due to the limited nature of the foreign data, it's unsuitable for interpretation, and therefore no further conclusions can be made.
Okay. The next one, well, actually, let me just do it this way. It might be a little shorter. In all of the vehicle swabs, was Mr. Garriman excluded from all of those?
He was either excluded or what we call uninformative.
Okay. And when it's uninformative, can you explain for the members of the jury what that means?
Yes, so uninformative, when I have that reference standard and I'm comparing it to the evidence profiles, we generate a statistic. So that's similar to the statistic that I've already talked about. If that statistic falls into a certain range, it's in what we call an uninformative range. So I can't say, yes, this person is included as a contributor to this profile, and I also cannot say, yes, they are excluded as a contributor to this profile. It's a range where we just can't say one way or the other if they're included or excluded, and that all relates back to the statistical number that was generated for that comparison.
Okay, and is there any further testing that can be done that would clarify that, or this is just kind of what we're left with the data that we have?
As of right now, this is the interpretation that was made in the statistic that was generated.
Okay, and though that includes all the swab, well, with some degree, like you kind of made some distinction that some of them were uninformative, but it's fair to say that there is never a positive identification of Jeffrey Gehrman's DNA in the Yukon.
Correct. Jeffrey Gehrman's DNA was not found to be individually included or support for inclusion based on the statistic in any of those swabs that came from the car.
Okay, and some of them were uninformative, so we don't know, we can't say he's included or excluded due to the sort of limitations on the data.
Correct. There's not sufficient support for either way.
Okay, so I'm going to put on the overhead now states 166, and these are other items that you analyze, which are Sperry shoes, a right shoe, a left shoe, a shirt, and some shorts.
Correct.
With regard to those items of evidence, were you able to generate data and draw conclusions?
Yes, so for all, pardon me, I'm referencing my report. For all the items of evidence from these items of clothing, so just to reference, that's going to be lab items 35, 36, 37, 38, the clothing samples. Those were all consistent with one male contributor, and Jeffrey Gehrman was included as a contributor to those profiles, and Robert Tellis was excluded.
Okay, so the DNA that is gathered off of these clothing items that we've discussed was consistent with one person, and that was Mr. Gehrman?
Yes.
Okay, lastly, in that last report, there were swabs that were taken from 2 bushes and a butterfly, is that right?
Yes.
And I'm going to put on the overhead states 149, and those swabs were reported to you as AB3, AB4, and AB5?
Yes, that is correct.
And what were your findings with regard to those swabs?
These swabs were all consistent with originating from one male contributor. Jeffrey Gehrman was included as a contributor to those profiles, and Robert Tellis was excluded as a contributor to those profiles.
Thank you very much. I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
You want a break? Please. Okay, all right. At this time, we're going to take a recess. During this recess, you're admonished not to discuss or communicate with anyone, including your fellow jurors, any way regarding the case or its merits, either by voice, phone, email, text, internet, or other means of communication or social media. Read, watch, or listen to any news or media accounts or commentary about the case. Do research, consult dictionaries, the internet, or reference materials. Do any investigation, test a theory, recreate any aspect of the case, or in any other way investigate or learn about the case on your own, or form or express any opinion regarding the case until it's finally submitted to you. Will be in recess till 11. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, next jury, please,
More continuing coverage in the Las Vegas reporter murder trial of Robert Tellis is on the way. From the Hidden Killers podcast and True Crime Today, press subscribe now.